Welcome, everyone. Hello, happy Monday. We're pleased to be with all of you today, and we're pleased to have Ilene Gordon and Bram Bluestein joining us for our latest edition of MIT Sloan Alumni Online. My name is Greg Batchelor. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at the MIT Sloan School of Management in the Office of External Relations. So Ilene and Bram will be discussing their new book, Doubling Down, A Secret Sauce for Dual Career Families. To give you all a sense of the format for today, we'll begin with some questions and discussion with Ilene and Bram, and then we'll go to our audience Q&A portion of the event. So as a reminder, our viewers can type their questions into the Q&A panel in the Zoom interface, and we'll hold time at the end to get to as many of those as we can. To start, let me introduce Ilene and Bram. Ilene is the retired chairman, president, and CEO of Ingredion Incorporated, a Fortune 500 company. She serves on multiple boards and is currently the presiding director of International Paper, a director of Lockheed Martin, and a director of International Flavors and Fragrances. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics, Phi Beta Kappa, from MIT, and a Master's of Science in Management from the MIT Sloan School of Management. She is also a former member of the MIT Corporation, and she will be joining the Sloan Executive Americas Board this fall. So Ilene, thank you for your volunteer service to MIT and Sloan. Bram is the co-founder of Bluestein and Associates LLC and Bluestein Ventures LLC. He also serves as a senior advisor to McNally Capital LLC. He was a director at Wheels Inc., an auto leasing company in the Chicago area for 25 years. His career in management consulting began at the Boston Consulting Group, followed by Booz Allen Hamilton and A.T. Kearney. Ilene and Bram have been married for over 40 years, and they have raised 2 successful children, and later they became experts at indulging 2 beloved grandchildren, all while managing their 2 high-impact careers. So I'd love to start with Ilene and Bram telling us a little bit more about themselves and their careers and setting the stage for us today. You're both business school graduates and you met after graduate school. So Ilene, maybe if you want to start and tell us a little bit more.
Great. Well, thank you again for the opportunity. Happy to be here. And I've been very excited about a great career. After Sloan, I spent 4 years at the Boston Consulting Group in the Boston, London, and Chicago offices. And my career there was spent half on international, which is now called global, and about half the time on consumer and half on industrial companies. And of course, I met Bram there, so it was a great company. I then spent 17 years in the corporation of Tenneco, which owned a division called Packaging Corporation of America. And that's when I started my acquisition career and my profit and loss responsibility career. Then I spent 10 years at Pechenay, a French company, which was then acquired by Alcan, which was then acquired by Rio Tinto. So I learned a lot about flexible packaging and international type companies. And then I spent 9 years, as you said, as the retired chairman, president, and CEO of what we called Corn Products, which later became Ingredion after we did a major acquisition. So many years in total. And Bram, I'll let you give your little background.
Just a small editorial correction. While she was at Corn Products, now Ingredion, she wasn't the retired chairman, president, and CEO. She's only now been retired for a couple of years. Well, Ilene and I actually met at BCG. Where I had settled into being a management consultant. We met shortly after I came back from having spent over a year in South Africa. So I had been with BCG for 4.5 years when I met Ilene and spent 7.5 years with BCG in Boston, South Africa, London, before we moved back to Chicago, which is where we finished up our careers at BCG. At a very young age, I became a partner at Booz Allen Hamilton, where I spent 7.5 years as a partner, and then moved to A.T. Kearney, where I spent 18 years before returning back to Booz as a senior partner where I spent another 5 years. So I had a very, very long and successful career as a management consultant. And I rewired about 10 years ago. And for the last 10 years, I've been in these advisory positions with McNally Capital and with Wheels. And it's in that time period when I launched Bluestein Associates and Bluestein Ventures, which is a venture capital firm that's focused on investing in good food. So we both had very active careers. At the same time, we like to say our most successful accomplishment was finding each other and getting married, and then having 2 great children. So, and that's what our book is all about.
Wonderful, thank you. And Bram, you mentioned that you met at BCG. Could you tell us that story?
Sure,
Bram,
I'll start it, and then I'll let Ilene pick it up. I mean, I was a very young consultant, and at BCG, the way your career progressed at BCG is you would work as a solo consultant, and then you get to the point where you manage a whole project. And so I was managing my first project, and that's a pretty intense and pretty serious milestone that you want to accomplish. And I had a big client meeting in 2 days, and the partner was going to come in and review the presentation, and I was getting ready for that, and I was looking at my watch, and I noticed that time was getting away from us, and he was running a little late. And finally, I was just so pent up with adrenaline that I went barreling into his office to find out, why he was so late for the most important meeting to me in my career. And lo and behold, he was interviewing this beautiful woman who I subsequently learned was Ilene Gordon.
And he was an MIT grad.
And he was an MIT grad as well. And
Yeah.
so they were engaged in this very deep conversation. And but I noticed what he was, that he was having a very successful interaction with her. And that's how we first met. And then I went off to South Africa shortly thereafter, and we met shortly after I came back.
So I love to tell the story of that. When we met, one of the reasons we met was we were both non-Harvard master's students, grads. So that was an important factor because BCG has been known to have more Harvard than non-Harvard people. I'm not sure if that's probably not true today.
Yeah, it can't be true today, but I do carry around a Columbia credential in my wallet.
Yes. But we met right when Bram came back from South Africa, and I do remember that we worked on another project together. But once we got married, that didn't happen at all. And I've always kept a separate name. That I'm not a Bluestein. My married name is Bluestein, but I'm a Gordon. I've always kept that. But it was a wonderful place to meet. And we were 2 single people, so it was a great operation, great opportunity to meet somebody with like-minded background.
Wonderful, thank you. So thinking about early on, how did you find a partner that aligned with your goals and your ambition, your career direction? Coming out of graduate school, you had an idea of where you were headed. How did you find that right partner?
Well, so like most men, I dated a variety of women when I was young with various career aspirations. And along the way, I realized that what I really wanted was somebody who was independent, ambitious, and successful in her own right. Fortunately, BCG, just like colleges and MBA programs, really helped, basically curate a pool of people who have similar capabilities and aspirations. And so while it took me a few years, once Ilene and I met, it took about 30 days before we became an item.
I always say that one of the first chapter of our book is becoming the right partner. And in the early editions, I love to tell the story that we were talking about finding the right partner. And a few people have said, but what if I'm already found that spouse? Every partner can become the right partner.
Right.
And so it's all about having the right metal and the influence and the discussions that we are happy to talk about.
Right.
So that's very possible.
Great. And so how did your goals change over time? So you just mentioned kind of becoming the right partner. For Ilene, did you always know that you wanted to be a CEO? I mean, even early on in your career?
I would say that early on, the advice that I got at MIT Sloan was get 5 years into your career before you have a family. And I never thought about having to choose career or family. I always wanted both. And I thought, why not? And so it did, it was always possible. Now, I would say that early on, I hadn't thought about being a CEO, but by the age of 28, which is still pretty young, a few years after graduate school, I knew that I wanted to be a CEO and run a major part of a company. My definition of was it Fortune 500, how large, did vary over time, but I always knew I wanted to run something, having left consulting.
In my case, having a family was almost a given. And Ilene had a plan, and when she moved from BCG to Signode, it was time to get started in having a family. So I really didn't have to change my aspirations. All we had to do was implement them.
Great, thank you. And in thinking about both of your careers and managing advancement, were there ever times when you had to prioritize one partner's career over another? And how did you make those decisions? What were those conversations like?
Well, I was thinking about that, we talk about in the book that you don't want to both change jobs at the same time. And so that's always a big piece of advice, because it wasn't a matter of prioritizing, but it was a matter of alternating. And we were lucky. I mean, you can't always control that, but it worked out. You can influence the time of those changes. And so that we always made sure that one person was in a new endeavor, not at a different time from the other person, and knowing that we would provide support to that person as they got into that role was very important. So I think that changing at the same time would be a big challenge at the same time as having a family.
So one of our significant considerations was meeting the challenges of being able to have and raise a family. But the other one was whether or not making a move made sense for both partners in our relationship, in this relationship, because our relationship is predicated on equality. I have two examples of that this really came into play in a significant way. The first is I had an opportunity to go to St. Louis and take a really big job. It was an executive committee responsibility. I was a great leader. I was very excited about it. And the recruiter said to me, but what about Ilene? What will she do if you accept this job? And I said, well, that's a really good question. I said, we should see and survey the marketplace and see how many opportunities there are for somebody with her talents and at her level. And he came back and he said, the good news is I found a few. The bad news is it's only a few.
And by the way, I never knew about all this.
And by the way, right, she didn't know at all about all this, but I basically concluded that this was not going to work out, because no matter how excited I was, it wasn't clear to me that she would be equally excited, and because she would be, slowing down rather than accelerating in her career. And so we basically, passed on that opportunity, and because it wasn't in the best interest of our collective situation. The second example was when Ilene had an opportunity to move to Paris and assume group responsibility for Alcan packaging. I mean, this was a huge, significant opportunity for her. It did represent executive committee responsibility, but more importantly, she was going to be the CEO of a $6 billion corporation. And one of the things people have always said about us is we've taken pride in each other's accomplishments. And I was going to be very proud of Ilene I was even proud of her for having been offered it. So without even consulting Booz Allen at the time, where I was the leader of the global automotive practice, I basically decided that this would be in our collective best interest. And if I was at the right firm, the firm would support it. And, when Ilene got the position, I did, call the firm, call the senior partners of the firm and tell them, and they got very excited about my relocation from Chicago to Paris because, leading a global practice meant I could, do it in Europe or do it in North America. From their point of view, as long as I continued to perform, they were very, very happy.
So I always say that one of the key lessons, and we talk about this in our book, is that companies are flexible. And I remember coming home that day to say to Bram, you know what, they want me to move to Paris and run all the packaging. And I don't know how I'm ever going to do that. And he said, of course you can do it. Just say yes and you'll figure it out. And they wanted to know quickly. So I actually said no the first time. And 2 days later, they said, well, we'll make some alterations. You'll make this happen. And Bram was supportive the entire time.
Right, because I fundamentally in a dual career relationship, you guys have to figure out, how you support your spouse so that she is she or he have every opportunity to be successful, because that's what she does for me. And I have to return that. So I always say the golden rule is you want to treat your spouse the same way that you would have her treat you.
Well, the interesting thing is that I ended up saying yes to this Paris opportunity. They said I had to move within a year. Then the company was acquired and we actually never moved there. So that's the sub part of the story. But we actually had a plan to do that.
Right.
And our family was going to figure it out. I think they were later in high school by then or college. So it was going to work out, but it was going to be a big challenge. And I think together we solved that problem,
right,
which was excellent. So I think that there's but changing jobs at the same time would have been a challenge. But there was support to do the right thing for the global responsibility. And having that global responsibility is actually what exposed me to the opportunity later on to become CEO of Corn Products, the global company.
Yeah.
MIT alumni are problem solvers. So certainly the idea of saying yes and we'll figure it out is something that probably resonates with our community here. I'm thinking back, when you consider your careers and look back, it can be sometimes really easy to kind of trace the straight line of how you navigated and made those decisions, and it can feel very linear. But in the moment, when you're weighing between 2 or 3 options, it can feel very amorphous and not linear. So was there ever a moment in either of your careers where you felt like you made a detour? Not necessarily a wrong move. There's, maybe no such thing as a wrong move, but any detours along the way, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I don't see, I know you don't see it as a linear set of decisions, but the desire is that you're frankly to make it an analytical problem, that you're improving your life happiness and you're improving your professional happiness and your family happiness all at the same time. And that's the trick in having a successful dual career family, which is, not viewing any change as a detour, but just, kind of building on the past and getting you ready for the next challenge.
What I would say also is, I know we talked about when I wanted to be a CEO, if we were willing to make a move to what I call a secondary city, that might have happened earlier. And so I played my cards and to end up with one in the Chicago area, which was fantastic. And so I never thought of that as a detour. I think that's what's important, is you can't think of it as a detour, and you have to realize that careers are not linear, but that you're gaining experience at all times. So by being a CEO of a division of a global international corporation based in Paris, I felt like I was getting great experience. And what's interesting is along the way, and I didn't mention this, is that I've had the opportunity to sit on boards of directors, and Greg, you mentioned that. And actually, you mentioned that I'm on 3 right now. I've actually been on 9 in total in my career, and I was the first female on 5 of them. And so during this time in Paris, when I was working for a French company, not being a CEO of a publicly traded standalone company, I was gaining experience as a board member. And so there were different ways to build your expertise. And what's great about careers today is that there's a lot of options.
Definitely, definitely. And so you've mentioned relocation, and certainly whether Chicago or Paris. How do you balance a career risk like that with family obligations? Once you have a family, all of the different factors that play into that decision-making process. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to start this because the first thing that you have to do is you have to create a set of rules. And the second thing you have to do is you have to build a very strong, I like to call it operating model. So the set of rules are most important around carving out enough time so that you have a family, as somebody described it, a romantic relationship with your spouse. And at the same time, you have enough time that you spend with your family, that you are, developing and imparting to your family what you want to. And the travel demand in the management consulting industry can be very heavy. As a result of that, sometimes it would encroach into the weekends, particularly as we began to travel more and more internationally. And we came up with a rule, the rule being the 48-hour rule. And that meant that you had to stay home for 48 hours to make it a complete weekend. And we found that that really allowed you to really have a complete weekend. If you allow for travel on Sunday night and you got home late Friday night, you spend all day Sunday worrying about that flight out Sunday night, and you only really get one day. And in the consulting business, if you don't get a weekend, you might not get 2 weekends, and you might not get 3 weekends, and all of a sudden it becomes a 7-day-a-week career. So rules were really valuable. And the second thing is having a really strong operating model was invaluable because we made some trade-offs and we prioritized childcare and child support so that we ensured that we could also prioritize our careers at the same time. So we didn't have kinds of some interruptions, which was the babysitter is late or somebody can't make it, because we took steps to ensure that we had strong care for our kids while we went off to go to work.
And I love, Bram, that you mentioned the 48-hour rule, because I remember this when we put that in, and what that meant was Bram had clients that would ask for an 8 o'clock on Monday morning meeting. And my having been a consultant, I knew that he could go to them and say, look, it can't be started at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And then he'd get his 48 hours in. And so you would actually go to them and mention that. And most of them were, they were very supportive, but they were, it was out of left field. They had no clue what you were talking about when you started.
Right,
So,
because most of our clients are like us, very ambitious, dedicated, focused individuals. And so when they call a meeting for 8 o'clock, they expect a meeting to be at 8 o'clock. But I said, you really don't want to do that. And they would say, well, why not? And I'd say, well, if you do that, then I'm going to violate the 48-hour rule. And they then say, well, what's the 48-hour rule? And I would explain it to them, and they would say, good point. I said, you will have a happier Bram at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning than you will if you're at 8 o'clock in the morning, because I have to come in the night before. And clients, individually are very flexible. Corporations, as large organizations, are not quite as flexible. So one of our messages in the book is it's up to the individuals to really organize their lives so that they can have a career and a family. And then secondly, request whatever accommodations they need in order to make that lifestyle succeed.
But I would say the corporations are even more flexible than they've ever been today. We recently had lunch with this current CEO who said, of course. So I would urge all new grads, our recent grads, everybody in a corporation today to go to the CEO or the executive team and say, look, I need this accommodation. And they're more than willing to do that. But a lot of people want the company to be flexible and put in policies. Well, policies are expensive. And companies, having been a CEO, I realized that we were very flexible and willing to do whatever accommodation we needed to do for the individual that made sense, but that putting policies in didn't always make sense.
Right. I mean, the part of the story that Jim told, I thought was fascinating because he was talking about how they were going to come up with rules for their hybrid model that they were going to implement in a couple of weeks. And he continued. He conducted an informal survey, and he asked one person, "How do you feel about these rules?" And she said she loved them, and proceeded to explain to him why. And he spoke to another person who said, "I don't buy into a hybrid model. I'd like to stay remote 100% of the time forever." And so he said, well, that demonstrates why we need to be flexible to meet individual needs, because both of these people he held in very high regard, and he really wanted to keep them in the organization.
Yeah, and on that point, so you both have led change in your careers and held leadership positions. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you've supported your direct reports or been a mentor in your company in being flexible? We're kind of course, thinking of the backdrop of the pandemic right now. It's affecting everyone from work, from home, and juggling all sorts of responsibilities to both. So how have you advocated for your employees and led change?
That's a great question. And actually in the book, we actually have a chapter which is called Weathering the COVID Stress Test and Flexibility. And we've asked a lot of people about how they're coping with all that. And I would say that companies are being very flexible. We're now leaving this period of only Zoom to hybrid models are okay, and people are being supportive of that. In my career, I was always flexible with my team and then wanted them to pass that on and be flexible and to understand what the challenges were of the different employees to get things done. And so I think that continued on my boards. I do that with the CEO and the executive team, and they continue to pass that along. So I think that flexibility, which is part of the makeup of a Sloan graduate, as you say, dealing with change and we'll figure it out, is a great way to be part of the workplace. And I know, Bram, that you guys have also done that.
Yeah, well, in the professional services business, mentoring is on everybody's agenda. I mean, especially if you go back to the years in which I was in the industry, your job was to clone yourself, and you knew that by cloning yourself, you created capacity for the organization to grow. And the only way you could clone yourself is spend time with the next generation and give them coaching as to how or what they should do in order to become successful. So it's clearly been a part of my DNA. The same way you'd coach a client, you'd also coach professionals and encourage them to come forward and ask for the accommodation, because what you knew is, based on our own personal experience, is if they asked, it meant that it was really important to them, and there was stress back home because and it was a pain point, and it needed to be addressed, and you needed to address that roadblock in order for them to perform at the highest level, which in the consulting business is what you aspire to.
But what's interesting is we're talking about mentoring employees. We also mentored our family very well. And I remember this wonderful story where our daughter was in middle school and wanted to be part of a basketball team. And I actually said, Bram, why don't you become the coach and I'll be your backup plan.
And I said, Eileen, that you're going to be my backup plan. Explain to me how that's going to work.
And so I remember the time when you once called and said, I can't get back for practice. And I said, don't worry, I'll figure this out. I'm in town. And so we worked as a team. And I actually went to practice that day with the young women. And I knew a little bit about basketball, but not enough to run a practice. And I went to the other coach in the room. We were sharing a gym. And I said, why don't we scrimmage? And he actually said, no problem. That sounds great. And so I used my creativeness from my Sloan background to figure that out. And when I came home that night and Bram and I spoke, I said, no problem. We had a great practice and the team is ready for when you're back.
Right. And one of the characteristics of dual career families is that, communication is frequent. In fact, dual career families talk more frequently than non-dual career families. They have a lot more to talk about. So we would talk before we go to bed if we were on the road, and we talk in the morning when we woke up. You work very hard to maintain the continuity of life all the time.
Wonderful. Well, you both have been leaders in the workplace, and we appreciate you taking the time to share your stories and your experiences with us today, everything that you've learned together. So switching gears just a little bit before we go into our Q&A with the audience. We've talked about work, we've talked about family, but for both of you, how have you cultivated your own individual passions outside of work and family and balanced all of that together?
Well, I would say that we're now in this chapter of, we call it rewirement, not retirement. And, I'm only 3 years out of leaving what was called corporate America, but being on boards, working on this book has been a great endeavor. And actually, we're giving advice to our son who has a venture firm. And Bram was a co-founder with our son, 8-9 years ago. Yeah. And so I've been spending time on all of that. A little bit of golf, a lot of walking and reading and thinking. But that's been the main part of the rewirement. I know, Bram, you've had a little bit more time.
So I think about our journey in life as one of continuous education. And so part of the reason that consulting was so fantastic for me is that I just love the challenge to learn and to study and to become expert in a variety of things over time. So, in this last phase that we call rewirement, you get to focus on those activities that are most exciting, but also that pose, the greatest educational opportunities. So, I've loved mentoring in this phase. I've loved spending time with the next generation. I've also tried to develop my golf game. I can't quite compete with those who've been playing it since they're 8 years old, but I can, compete with those folks who are either 10 years younger than me or those who kind of picked it up mid-career. And again, Eileen and I set some rules, and we agreed on kind of informally, how many rounds a week I would get to play and how many rounds I would get to play if we were off on a trip. And, sometimes she's saying to me, you're not playing enough, and because she realizes it's a passion of mine. And sometimes, I'm saying, oh yeah, I got distracted by some other exciting opportunities. So, we've always found ways to develop those passions and to carve out the time and carve out time for the family and for ourselves.
And I would say that we both love travel. So that's continued. And I love to share that we are big gin players. And my greatest excitement is when I beat Bram, which is not very often, but I really do well. I hold my own, would you say?
Yeah, I think that Eileen has learned how to play gin. She's tried some strategies, which I guess in the interest of or Sloan, you would consider them to be dry holes. But now she's on a streak where she's found a winning strategy. And you can see in her face how happy she is that she does that. And we do play gin now frequently as just a way of, kind of passing the time.
Great. Well, I do want to say to our audience that the book is coming out in a few short weeks this fall, so stay tuned for more information about that, doubling down there on screen. Would love to ask you, what has the process been like working on this book together? And if you could share any stories along the way.
It's interesting, and I love to tell this story, and I know Bram's been part of it, is we work with some co-writers, and we started about a year ago, and it's interesting how they said, well, we should take a year to do this. We said, well, we want to do it in 6 months, and always raising the ante of the goals. And they said, okay, if you want to, we can do that, but it's going to take X. And so we made ourselves available. Working together on it meant being very organized. I remember every Tuesday morning, we've talked to our co-writers and worked through that and stayed on schedule. It ended up being a 7-month process, not 6. And it's taken a few months more to get it published, but the whole process is about a year. But it's been great working together, and it brought back a lot of memories.
Yeah, Ilene and I have spent more time working on this book than we've probably done anything in our marriage. So, it's been, we've attacked it just like a project, and as CEO, she set the goals and accelerated them. And, as the consultant in chief, I worked hard and thought hard about the intellectual content in order to make sure that what we were imparting was good advice. And so what's been really satisfying to us is that those who have had a chance to review the manuscript have given us very positive feedback from the CEOs of major corporations, chief people officer, other consultants, and most importantly, or interestingly, leading psychologists and
diversified couples.
And diversified couples who had a chance to see that it's set up in a way where we tell our life experiences, we give advice, and then we share with you what's in the literature that supports why what we intuitively landed on actually makes some sense. So it's been fun.
Excellent. Maybe one last question before we go to Q&A, and maybe more for Ilene. How have you found meaningful ways to stay connected to MIT and Sloan as a proud graduate? If you could just share a little bit with us.
And people know that I actually am a real Bostonian. So for me, any opportunity to be there is fantastic. And my family's no longer there. They're more in the New York area. But I have a lot of friends. And so by being at MIT, I was actually a member of the MIT Corporation as an alumnus for 5 years. I think I left about 2 years ago. And now, as you mentioned, I'm joining the Sloan Executive Board of the Americas, actually officially right now, but for starting in the fall and then next spring. So MIT is a place that really helped me meet great people and learn how to solve problems. And so it's very important for me to stay connected in some ways. And so these are the ways, that I've stayed involved. There's always opportunities. I wish I could do more, but whenever I have an opportunity to meet other graduates, I take it. So it's been fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ilene and Bram, for sharing with us today some of your stories. We'll go to audience questions now. And one to get us started, one is specifically about kind of reaching the C-suite. So how did you support each other in that executive growth? Did you consult with each other? Did you have executive coaches? How did you kind of take that leap?
I'll start, and then Bram, I'll turn it to you. But I would say that we used each other. We did not have an executive coach. They were just becoming more and more popular. But I would actually turn to Bram, who was a little more senior to me, and say, what do you think of this opportunity? So I love to tell the story that in Chicago, where we are based, where most of our careers have been, we were very excited about the Economic Club of Chicago. And I once received an invitation to attend a dinner. And I said, should I take it? He said, of course. And then Bram ended up being invited independently. And we were at the same table with different names and nobody knew we were married. And then Bram, I know that near the end of the dinner, you told somebody we were, and they felt a lot better about the way we were looking at each other.
Yeah, I had this great conversation with this senior executive. Yeah, we were both rather young at the time. And, I said, I'd like to introduce you to my wife. And I pointed to Eileen and he said, oh, she's your wife? I said, yes. And he said to me, I am so happy. I said, why is that? He said, because the way you two were making eyes at each other over dinner, it was like
a scandal.
It would have been a scandal had you not been married. But in this journey, once Eileen decided that she wanted to run a business, that was her decision, not my decision. My job was to help her realize that goal. And it was when she decided that she wanted to run a corporation, it was my job to help her. It was the world's job to decide which opportunities to present to her.
No, I didn't have an executive coach, but I had great mentors and champions at the companies, and I would always seek them out. And so that's one thing people ask a lot about is, should I get a mentor? Should I get a sponsor? And, I say it's always somebody who knows you well that's most important. And so Bram was a mentor. I had other mentors. My father had been a mentor, people at my companies, and they gave me, you want people who give you great feedback, not just nice stuff, but the tough stuff. And I actually had a mentor and he was a tough guy, but gave me great input all the time. So that's how you get your learning, and you have to be a learning person to be open to that type of feedback.
And as a spouse of somebody who has these kinds of aspirations, I had to find a way to explain to my team that, there were times when I was going to have to put Eileen's priorities ahead of my priorities. And so I used to tell my, the phone would ring, and I literally was spending 4 or 5 days a week in Detroit. And so it was very important that I prioritize Eileen's call. I would say client number one is on the phone. And everybody knew client number one was Eileen. And I also developed another label that I used very frequently called Mr. Gordon, because we had established separate professional identities. And I learned very early on from one of Eileen's mentors that when I was at one of her events, my goal was to support her and not promote myself. And he made that crystal clear to me as we went off to our first dinner, and he almost backed me into the side of a bus so that I understood what my responsibilities were. And after that, I realized that I could change my priorities, be Mr. Gordon, and still be very successful. And so the next day, rather than get on my brand new PC, connected remotely by telephone to my email box someplace, because this is going back a few years. Instead of sending emails out as a partner of a management consulting firm, I was heading out to go pottery shopping with the spouses. And that was extremely well received, both by the spouses as well as by Eileen's mentor. And, in the future, I always said I need to recognize when I'm going to be Mr. Gordon versus when I'm going to promote my own self-interest, which I do quite well as Mr. Bluestein.
Great, thank you. We have a comment that came in that said, I love the 48-hour rule. So thank you for sharing that. And so kind of following on with that, this alum has a question about more of the logistics of a typical work week, especially in the early years with your kids' lives and balancing your career. So some of that more kind of practical, how do you actually get it all done? Could you share a little bit more about that?
That's interesting because in the book, we actually talk about how we always had a Sunday night meeting with the kids. We'd have dinner, and that's when we would organize the week, and we talk about everybody's schedule for the week. I know today people have a big board for everybody's meetings, but we would talk about it, and we actually would end the dinner with a little treat like a cupcake or a piece of cake or a cookie, and the kids loved that, and they didn't realize that we were having a family meeting. But today they laugh about it because they know that when they look back and they've read the book, that they see that was a meeting. So that was important logistically. We also had a nanny. At that point, we could afford, and in the world, a live-in. And Bram talked about not worrying about somebody being there or the car breaking down. And we actually logistically bought a car that was a utility car for the kids, and the nanny would drive it. And we were in the suburbs of Chicago, and she would come up, and we would let her take it home on the weekends, and she'd come in the morning on Monday morning to be there so I could leave for work. And then, but her request was that on Fridays that I would not come home too late, so she could then leave. And so that's what Bram talked a little bit about, the golden rule, treating other people how you want to be treated. That was very important to respect that. And she was fantastic. So logistically, she would work with the kids during the week, and they had a eating schedule and a homework schedule, and we could work through that. So I would say those were the key elements: the nanny, who was an enabler with a great car and a great set of values, and the Sunday night meeting and the 48-hour rule. Those three things together really made it all work. And then what Bram talked about.
I mean, we knew that there's no perfect when it comes to managing the family. So, what you have to do is put in place a plan and then deal with how you're going to manage the imperfect that occurs in the course of the week. And the best way we found to do that, as Eileen said, is to create this Sunday night dinner and have a treat for the kids so that they would come and participate and not hold back. And we could then figure out what was necessary to at least meet a minimum standard in the course of the week, and also begin the planning for anything that was longer term. Because if they had a science project that needed to be done over a couple of weeks, the sooner we knew what we had to get going on, the better. So this concept of there are a lot of if you like the 48-hour rule, I do think you'll like the book a lot, because there are a lot of rules that we created over time about one parent at a time, Mr. Gordon, client number one, which actually, they help you kind of define this operating model that gives you confidence that it's going to work. And that allows you to be as successful as you can be at your career. And then if you're successful at your career and you're successful at home, that leads to a tremendous sense of accomplishment.
And one thing I'd like to add is that, a lot of people say, well, a live-in nanny is kind of unaffordable. And I tell people that when I finished MIT as an undergrad, I had a lot of student loans. And over time, we worked through that, which was very challenging. But the nanny was an investment towards the future. And so it was very helpful to think about it that way, that it wasn't about just building up your income, but investing in the future.
Right. That was the toughest decision, or one of the toughest decisions we had to make for me. Right, because Eileen had a very tough decision, which was to prioritize in her own mind, spending time at work rather than spending time with the family. I had to prioritize the fact that somebody else was going to spend a lot of time with my family, and it took me a little while to kind of understand that, but I realized how important that was to really putting in place this operating model that, raised both of our confidence that we could be successful at work. And once I finally, got that into my head, I said, this is a really worthwhile investment. And it's not as if we had a lot of resources, we just reprioritized so that we could afford to do it.
Thank you, that's helpful. One of the questions that came in from an alum is maybe a little bit more personal, but as you are juggling travel and family, how do you deal with maybe some guilt of not being able to be there? If you've missed an important milestone, or, if you could just speak a little bit about that.
It's I'll start out, and Bram, I know if you want to answer it, but we do talk about that in the book. I don't want to oversay that, but I'm a big believer in not feeling guilt. I mean, it's always there, but you have to surround yourself with believers. Now, I love to tell the story, and we do talk about this, that my mom grew up in another world, and she would have her perception of how I was going to make it work, which was to stay home. And then I convinced her later on, and she only passed away in her 90s. So she saw this whole 40 years, and she actually became a believer that it was doable, that our kids were great, our careers were doing well. But in her world, she never saw a model that we could do that. And we became the pioneers to do that. So I would say that part of it is to surround yourself with positive people on making this happen, to put that in the back of your mind, and to have a great spouse who supports it all and mentors, and that to feel the success, and to have a career that has some flexibility, that you can be at a lot of important events, but it's sharing that. And a lot of times now, I'll tell you that I feel like if Bram's there, we don't have to both be there. It's called divide and conquer. And we did that with our kids, with a lot of these events, and that it's true, it'd be great if both can be there, but if they can't, if one can be there, that's great.
Yeah, who said you have to miss important milestone events?
Yeah.
I mean, that's if you miss important milestone events, then you should feel some guilt. Now, I think over time our definition of what an important milestone event is, changed. And so, some of the less important milestone events we may have missed, and we learned to live with that guilt. But one, important milestone for us was that we were committed to meeting up every Saturday night, and that we were going to forego guys' weekends and girls' weekends in order to be together on Saturday night and make it into a date night. In our 40 plus years of marriage, we've missed less than 10, which is very surprising given the amount of travel. But it also helped to define priorities as you thought about, when you left for a South Asian trip, or when you came back from a South Asian trip, because we weren't going to miss Saturday night being together, and that was probably the most important milestone in our marriage.
But Brent, that's interesting when you mentioned South Asian trips. I remember that I had some Asian trips that started Monday morning meetings, and I would say, well, can't we meet Tuesday morning, even if there were other people involved, because I was willing to speak out, and people would say, of course, why not? And that meant I could leave on Sunday or Monday and still be there for Tuesday, as opposed to leaving on Saturday evening and not miss one of those important Saturday nights.
Right.
So it's a matter of being proactive and organized, and you don't always have to reveal why you're asking it. But teams are pretty resilient, and companies, as we said earlier, are.
Great, thank you. So Ilene and Bram, your children are grown. And so you were both models for them. How has your own pursuit of a dual career really shaped your children's perception of work and career? Or have you had conversations with them now, even as adults, where they can kind of think back, like, oh, that's how you make it work. How have you influenced your kids?
That's a great question. I'll start out, Bram. But it's interesting how our kids, if you ask them, they don't feel like they took a back seat. They knew their parents were a little different, but they don't feel like they lost out a lot. Though I would say that the nanny is very important part of our family. So I love to tell the story that our nanny is still in the Chicago area, and she's with her own family. And one day she was ill, and my daughter, I was CEO of a company. She said, I got to go see her. I said, of course. So we dropped everything. We changed our schedule and we went to see her. And so she's an important part of our life. And so I think that they know that there's respect, but I always tell people, your kids will know who the parents are and who's the nanny. So as I said, we respect her. Was always part of our family. She still is. But they know who mom and dad are, and they're wonderful human beings. And I don't know if that's a reflection of us or the nanny, but if you choose somebody who has the same values, they're going to have those values. And so they're great kids, great family.
Yeah. I think the way it's played out is in the area of balance, most importantly. And that is that both of our kids have aspirations to be very successful professionally and in a family setting. And they, have a slightly different formula of balance than perhaps Ilene and I do, because it's a response to some extent to the fact that we found the right balance, but they are beneficiaries of that and have the ability to be a little more focused on having a good work lifestyle balance. But as Ilene says, they've turned out to be two great kids pursuing their own aspirations.
Wonderful. We are coming to the top of the hour, so I'd love to invite both of you to just share any parting thoughts about the book and your work. If you could close us out.
Yeah, I think about, I love that people have glommed on to a couple of the key ingredients, as Bram called it, an operating model, whether it's the 48-hour rule or the separate identities, the Mr. Gordon persona, or the communication. But these are all part of making it all work. And I always say to people, to couples, this is a worthwhile endeavor. And we have an introduction in the book where I say, don't give up. It's not easy, but it's doable. And to Sloanies, why not?
Yeah, this has been a great journey for the two of us. And we've obviously loved just about every moment of it, and capturing it and putting it into a book is a way for us to tell you what worked for us. But this is an important time in the history of America. It's really important that this economic recovery be built with men and women truly engaged in the workforce. And so we think our advice is more valuable today than ever before. But you have to find your own model for meeting these challenges. And as Ilene says, don't give up, because corporations will be more flexible, they'll be more responsive, and it's your opportunity to help them write the rules that will make dual career families even more successful than we have been in ours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ilene and Bram. I do want to thank you for taking the time today and sharing your expertise with our audience. You can also find more information about pre-ordering their book. We'll be sending a follow-up email to all of our registrants with more information, and we'll be including a link to the recording of this session. So thank you to our viewers for joining us. As we conclude our event, you will see a survey appear on your screen. We invite you to fill that out and let us know your feedback on today's event. And again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ilene and Bram. It's been a pleasure.